Hello, and welcome back to What the Trans, USA episode number 10. My name is Clementine. I'm a queer with she, they pronouns and a law degree that I don't actually practice law with. This is going to be a bit of a different episode compared to what we normally do. First, I'm your only host today. I know, very sad, but fear not, I won't be the only voice you're hearing. What we have for you is a recorded interview with Evan Urqhart, a trans journalist and the founder of Assigned Media. For those of you not familiar with Evan's work, Assigned Media is a US based trans news organization dedicated to covering trans issues from a perspective that is by and for trans people. Sounds pretty similar to what we do here at What the Trans. And honestly, that's a good thing. We need more organizations like Assigned Media, especially as we get closer and closer to Donald Trump's second term as president. Unfortunately, the incoming rapist and racist in chief isn't the only threat facing our community. The conservative 6-3 Supreme Court, including 3 Trump appointees, recently heard United States v. Scrimeti, a case that asked the Supreme Court to decide whether or not bans on gender-affirming care for minors are constitutional. Evan was in the courtroom for these arguments, and he agreed to come on the show to talk to me about his experience covering one of the most important Supreme Court cases of the term. And I truly mean that because, as you'll hear from our conversation, the consequences of this case will extend far beyond trans rights. I think that's enough prologue from me, so without further ado, here's my conversation with Evan. Evan, could you give yourself a little bit of an introduction so everybody knows who you are?
I'm a American transgender journalist. I founded Assigned Media, which is a transgender news website. And I'm also currently at MIT doing a science journalism fellowship.
Yeah, thank you so much again for being here today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you, particularly about your coverage of Scrimeti, which is a really important case that just happened or just had oral argument at the Supreme Court this past week from when we're recording. Evan, do you want to give a little bit of a basic overview of the case and what's going on? For our listeners, I think we know that transgender healthcare is kind of at the center of this, and we're talking about specifically a ban on trans minors from Tennessee. But I'd love to get into some more of the specifics that we have.
Yeah, so over the past 2 years, I think originally starting, the first one was in 2021, we've seen 24 states ban really all gender affirming care, so all puberty blockers and all hormone therapy if it is used for the purposes of treating gender dysphoria. And there are further 2 states that have banned only surgeries, which is a much kind of lower priority. These surgeries are very rare for minors, and a lot of times the states that have banned only surgeries don't have the surgeries in those states. So it's really the puberty blocker and hormone therapy bans that are really concerning. And the laws very explicitly carve out every other possible purpose for using these same medications. They allow the medications to be used for intersex children. Allow them to be used for, purely the psychological effects of early puberty. It's really solely trans youth who are barred from accessing the medications in any way. And the question before the court was specifically whether this is sex discrimination. So, are you discriminating based on sex if you say that a natal male can take testosterone in order to bring on puberty at a normal, time for his age, but a natal female can't take the same exact medication for the same purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fantastic overview. And you honed in on exactly right, which is the sex discrimination point, which is really fascinating. So to be a bit of a lawyer about this, not a practicing attorney, so no legal advice, no fun. But I know that in Tennessee, the case was argued before a district court, and the district court agreed that this was sex discrimination and issued an injunction blocking this from actually taking place in Tennessee originally. This was unfortunately appealed to the Sixth Circuit, where the Sixth Circuit overturned that injunction and said it wasn't sex discrimination. And now we're up at the Supreme Court, where that's really the big question, right? There are some other issues, things like parental rights, that have become a big topic at the Supreme Court, but the court declined to take that up as part of this question. And so really thinking kind of about whether or not this is sex discrimination. Could you talk a bit more about like how the court was thinking about that this week when you were covering it, and what kind of the conversations were about what sex discrimination meant, especially in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back and we should at least briefly talk about heightened scrutiny versus rational basis. So, the court basically applies, it tells the lower courts to apply different levels of scrutiny to a law if it is categorizing people based on sex. And so, it's not to say that you couldn't have different health guidelines for people who are, have more of a female body type or more of a natal male body type, but it would be subject to, a higher scrutiny like, oh, is this really, in people's best interests, in their health interests, or is there some kind of discrimination going on? So it doesn't seem that anyone believes that the law would pass heightened scrutiny, which is sort of the subtext throughout, is that no one seems to be really arguing that there is a genuine public health need for this law and that it's protecting the health of these children. They're arguing that the state shouldn't have to prove that it is good for the children that it is regulating. And I think that's an important context to kind of bring forward because it's kind of an unstated undercurrent, which is not that this is protecting children from unsafe medications, but that the state is allowed to ban this medication because it wants to. So the arguments at the court really focused on drilling down into what exactly is sex discrimination. And there are, I believe, precedents that say if you're classifying based on sex, then it should trigger this heightened scrutiny. And the state of Tennessee was saying, well, they're not classifying based on sex, they're classifying based on the purpose for the medication. And then, sort of the liberal justices would bring forward the point that, well, you can't really know what the purpose of the medication is without first classifying based on sex. And they kind of went back and forth. The attorney for the state kind of fell apart under that questioning. Not that anyone necessarily thinks that it's going to matter.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. The way we talk about, first off, like the subtext of this, right? That the subtext is that the law is a bad law, and everybody kind of knows that it's a stinker of a law. But the question is really whether or not Tennessee is allowed to pass bad laws that, hurt trans people, and less so whether or not this is a law that's hurting trans people. And I think it's really fascinating that that's what the conversation ends up being about. And so, geez, I mean, related to that, I'll say that like this is also a constitutional issue, right? So talking about equal protection, we're talking about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And so I know there's been some conversation, particularly at the court, talking about something like Bostock, right? Which is a statutory case that I think came up a little bit during the oral arguments. And I know that the conservative justices were hesitant to apply that. Bostock is a case that ruled that in employment cases, right, under employment discrimination law, under Title IX, that a transgender employee couldn't be fired because they were transgender. And it specifically ruled that that was a form of sex discrimination, right? There's some fancy lawyering, I think, like you saw earlier, about Tennessee saying that it's not sex discrimination and saying that it's a different type of classification, right? Using our words to kind of dance around things. And I'm curious if, from your like experience, you saw Bostock come up, that's kind of statutory precedent aspect of it get played with at all by people, or whether that just seemed to be kind of irrelevant at the arguments.
Bostock was certainly relevant. So I think what I perceived, and I'm not a lawyer, and medical coverage is much more my main area rather than legal coverage. So I do want to be really careful and encourage you to kind of check my work a little bit. But let me see. Hang on. Who was it? Yeah. So Justice Alito especially seemed really interested in the precedent set by Dobbs and Geduldig. So Dobbs was very famously the case that overturned Roe versus Wade. and said that women don't have the right to choose whether or not they need an abortion in consultation with their doctors. And so this precedent of Dobbs, I think, was really represented as something that was only about abortion, only about considering the life of the fetus. But now we're starting to see how there's maybe this new strain of precedent which says, actually, when it comes to medical areas, it's perfectly okay for states to discriminate on the basis of sex. And so this Dobbs and Godildig was a case where I believe pregnancy was allowed to be carved out of like insurance coverage, and that wasn't discrimination based on sex. It was a very bad precedent that basically enshrines basically enshrines sex discrimination into healthcare law, and it seems like this sort of zombie sex discrimination is what the very conservative court is trying to kind of bring back. And, I don't think they will explicitly overturn Bostock, but it's kind of a way to make Bostock irrelevant and open the door for sex discrimination, not just concerning trans people, but just in general, to be more current, more something that states are allowed to do, less something that the Supreme Court, led by these conservative justices, is interested in providing a check on.
I think that's a really fascinating point that you make about weakening Bostock, right? Because the other thing is it's a lot of administrative law. It's a lot of how, say, the Biden administration decides to enforce Bostock, right? One of the things that the Biden administration did early on was apply Bostock to housing, for example, in the Fair Housing Act. So they expanded the interpretation to actually prevent discrimination against transgender people in housing, which is something that hadn't technically been done before, right? And that's also something that a conservative Trump administration can simply undo. And I don't see a reason why they wouldn't undo it, unfortunately. But it's fascinating that the court is also carving out the space in the constitutional law sense, right? They're saying we don't have to touch Bostock, we don't have to be showy in that way, right? Because it can simply be administrated away by a new president. Whereas in this other area of the constitutional law, they're really focused in on it. I also think the point about Geduldig and Dobbs are really important, right? Because Dobbs is this new precedent that has kind of cropped up that was, as you said, supposed to be confined and contained. Justice Thomas's concurrence says otherwise, and I think we're really seeing the results of that. And then when you bring up Geduldig, I think that also has a lot of applications to the current case in the sense of it's talking about biological differences versus sex-based classifications, right? And I think that's a really hard line to split if we're talking in like a logical sense, right? What is the difference between a sex-based classification and a biological difference between men and women, right? I don't know if you want to talk more about that or if the idea of kind of biological differences came up in court at all as we were talking about trans people and us maybe being just biologically different when it comes to this legislation.
Yeah, there was a really interesting line of questioning from Justice Thomas, which was basically asking, does testosterone do something different in the body of a natal female than it does in the body of a natal male? And the answer is no. And the answer, I think, perhaps surprisingly to Justice Thomas, is no. Testosterone grows facial hair for a natal woman as much as it does for a natal male. It lowers voices. It has other effects that are very similar. It's not like, and everyone makes testosterone, everyone makes estrogen is also perhaps a surprise to people whose maybe science education is based in this extremely strong dichotomy between males and females that doesn't actually exist perhaps in biological reality.
Yeah, I think that kind of brings me to a good point, which is that like there's kind of two things going on here that I see. One is bad lawyering, and the other is kind of bad science coming together to really make this kind of soup where it may not be necessarily that the justices hate trans people or are going to like all cuss us out. I don't know about some of them, especially what they do behind closed doors. But it seems fascinating to me that really what's going on is a lot of like those two things, right? In terms of bad lawyering, it's the legal argument saying, well, it's not sex-based, it's a biological difference, and as you point out, it's bad science where the biological difference doesn't exactly hold up once you put that under scrutiny. I think related to that, I was fascinated that something like the Cass report came up in conversation, which is a United Kingdom report, or I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with that. Would you mind talking a little bit about how that got brought up in court and whether you thought that was really relevant to the conversation?
I believe it was, and now I'm like second guessing myself. I believe it was Justice Kavanaugh who brought up the Cass report. Am I right?
It was Alito.
It was Alito. It was Alito who brought up the Cass report.
And it's not in the record for what it's worth. This wasn't before the court. This is something that he brought up on his own.
So, all of this gets to what I have been spending the past several months looking at, and what I'm going to be working on for this fellowship project, which is how do U.S. courts interact with medical evidence. And it turns out that, at least in this case, and sort of more and more, courts are sort of reluctant to have a full trial where different expertise is judged and a full fact record is developed, and instead they want to kind of move to decide these sort of law points without kind of really delving into what the facts are. So the medical evidence in this case very much came in through these amicus briefs, which are kind of submitted by friends of the court, such as the American Medical Association, and other friends of the court, such as anti-trans extremists, who are all kind of saying different things about the medical evidence. And the point there is that I think that Justice Alito's bringing in of some of this stuff that hadn't even been in the amicus briefs is sort of like an even further extension of just kind of using the medical evidence more as vibes than as like a scientific truth that can sort of be judged and adjudicated as one side has stronger evidence. And so Alito was really kind of going particularly far in that direction of kind of bringing in stuff he's hearing from Fox News about the Cass report, and just kind of using it to make this argument that the science is unsettled, therefore it should be the state of Tennessee that gets to decide what the science says.
Yeah, that's really interesting for a couple reasons. One, I think it's fascinating how the conversations around and about trans people really matter and influence the real world of things, right? Even though we may be like 1% of the population, right? We're not changing the voting of this country necessarily, but the ways we're talked about certainly comes back into things like the high court, and what some of the most powerful people in the country are saying about us in a very public platform. I also think it's interesting because Alito was talking about this kind of for a specific reason, which is that, if the science is unsettled, it gets to be decided, right? But I don't think that exactly answers what you said was the core of the case, right? Which is whether or not this is sex discrimination. So do you think that all this kind of conversation or this bringing up of medical evidence is helping us get to like the legal answer that we're looking for? Or is it just kind of playing some other role and not being as helpful as it really should be?
So I asked Chris Geithner about this because he goes to the court all the time and knows a lot more than I do. And what he said was that, if the court wants to make a decision based on what they understand the medical evidence to be, they're allowed to do that because they're the Supreme Court. So, so I was saying what they were doing there, is what Alito was doing there, sort of sneakily trying to decide whether intermediate scrutiny, whether the law could still stand up under intermediate scrutiny, and then make a decision kind of sneakily based on that, but, outwardly not based on that. And I think maybe there's some of that going on where they sort of want to judge the medical evidence, but then make a decision that makes no reference to it. But what Chris was saying was they're the high court. They could decide that they're applying intermediate scrutiny and it passes or doesn't pass that threshold, which I thought was interesting and grounding for me, because I tend to maybe be a little bit a little bit quick to see bad faith, and we're not going to know what's part of the decision until we get the decision.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting how much the idea of like vibes keeps coming up when we talk about the court, right? I think over the past few years, that has been increasingly the feeling that it is vibes going on and less so law going on at the high court, and more so really seeing an exercise of judicial power to say what the law is, and really as well what the law should be, to borrow a FedSoc phrase there. Do you have anything else that you could talk about in terms of like the vibes of the courtroom, right? And what was going on and how it felt, sitting there talking to people, or I guess really listening to the justices have conversations, listening to Chase Strangio, for example, from the ACLU, the first known trans litigant in the court or advocate to step in front of the court. Things like that, just kind of what the experience was like, and then how that compared to maybe what you thought being in the Supreme Court was going to be like.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak for anyone else, but for me as a trans person being there, I really started the day kind of, entering that press room and entering the high court on somewhat of a high, just thinking, here I am, little Evan Urquhart, little trans guy, walking into the highest court of the land to report. This is the kind of thing that you think of as like a career high, to get to be there in person and do something like that. And I think that really shifted as I listened to, you know, a number of cis people plus Chase, sort of intellectualizing and debating healthcare that I feel has saved my life, healthcare that is necessary for the children at the heart of this case and so many other children. Um, and just thinking about all the trans people who don't have the privilege to be there in that room, whose lives are being decided by these these people who don't care about us and who don't care if this healthcare is necessary for us and who are willing to sort of decide the case even if everyone sort of knows that this is hurting children, and just come up with a way to get there because that's their ideological commitment. Now, again, I don't know that's what they're doing, but it definitely felt in the room like there was plenty of room for them to do that if that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Evan. I really appreciate that. And like, I think it means a lot to hear that. I also think like what you said about intellectualizing us is such a real thing. As someone who like has been to law school, I can tell you so many times that I've been intellectualized in a classroom instead of being seen as a human being, right? Instead of being treated and like seen as a whole person in front of the law, in front of this legal system, or a concept or an idea, you can be fit into a smaller box, into a word, right? There's a great legal philosopher and feminist, Patricia Williams, who talks about how the law tries to create simpler truths instead of dealing with it in its full complexity. And so I really think it's important to make space and room for that complexity, especially in the law, because that complexity allows us to be human, to be fully ourselves, whereas these kind of simpler truths about whether or not something is sex discrimination or a biological difference might be easier for a judge or a court to navigate through because they don't have to deal with that complicated reality.
It's true, and I also think that when you're in that game of simplifying things down, you know, to me, the most simple thing is a public health ordinance should, contribute to public health, right? Like it should not be legal for a legislature to claim that they're acting in the public health and to harm the public. And so that seems very simple and very easy to sort of rationally go through. And that viewpoint didn't seem to be present really. Um, and I do think it's concerning that it doesn't. I've been thinking a lot about possible implications for this case beyond transgender healthcare. And I think many people have mentioned bans on contraception as a possibility. I also think bans on parents vaccinating their children based on a conspiracy theory that says vaccinations are damaging is sort of supported and maybe even easier to support, if the court is going in this direction because there would be no sex discrimination angle. And so I think it's very dangerous to have these tests and to say, well, rational basis means the state can just do anything, even if it's harming the people it's supposed to help. Like that just does seem like a complete miscarriage of justice, and that we should be, I think, a little more worried. And I think people are maybe less worried because trans people are a small minority and people don't know us and people don't know that our healthcare works just like anyone else's healthcare and is as necessary as anyone else's healthcare. And so, sort of the precedence that's being created is going to be for the whole country, not just for trans people.
Yeah, you are so right. This is major constitutional law stuff that is going down right now in the Supreme Court. Like this is stuff that's going to be in textbooks and is going to be talked about for years to come, right? I think one of the other things that like what you said really brings up in my mind is the court's inability or unwillingness to see invidious discrimination versus benign discrimination, right? And their real focus on it needing to be kind of like Jim Crow segregation level discrimination for them to like get that discrimination is happening. Whereas what is going on right now, where I can say, I'm helping you while actively harming you, uh, and the court just treats that as reality. And I think, kind of as you bring up, setting a precedent where you just believe the state at face value that they're not hurting somebody isn't very good, because we can write down whatever we want as we pass a law. And I don't know that that necessarily makes it true, if you want to add some more to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the main arguments on the anti-trans side, on the state of Tennessee's side, is that the science is uncertain. But if you know anything about science, you know that it's always uncertain. And you can always manufacture uncertainty if uncertainty doesn't already exist. So again, it's very dangerous to have this idea that like, well, when the science is certain, we'll do this, but when the science is uncertain, we'll do that. You're just going to end up doing that because it's always uncertain, at least in the technical sense that science can always yield to new evidence. Science is always open to dissenting viewpoints. There's not sort of a council of science that says this is certain for all time. That's sort of completely opposed to what science is as a project.
It's very similar to the law in the sense where something can be set as precedent, but it being precedent obviously does not mean it's going to last forever, right? We've had many terrible precedents that lasted for far too long in this country, and we've had, good precedents that have been overturned and overruled when the time has been considered right by certain people. I guess that kind of brings us to the question. I think we kind of know what's going on in this case, in the sense that there are three rather conservative justices who seem very opposed to trans people and what is going on in the case. There are three liberal justices who seem to be supportive and defensive of trans people in a more robust way. And there are three justices who seem to not have a lot to give either way. Potentially, I think, far more conservative than either of us would like in their general inclinations. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts were doing the age-old exercise of reading the tea leaves in the courtroom, even though, as you said earlier, there's no way to tell what the actual outcome is until the outcome is done.
Yeah, I mean, so Neil Gorsuch, who was the one who wrote the Bostock opinion, which said that in employment discrimination, discriminating against a trans person is the same as sex discrimination. He was completely silent. And then Justice Amy Coney Barrett also seemed to have, some interesting questions, seemed to be really engaging with the law, and not be kind of demonstrating that she had already sort of come down on a side or not. And of course, I am saying all of that before saying what I really think, which is that this is a court that is dominated by very extreme conservative ideology and has shown a real appetite to make wildly unpopular, extreme decisions, such as like granting total presidential immunity for all crimes and like overturning Chevron deference, which means that the courts are now going to individually review every single regulation in the United States. Just kind of real swings towards far right ideology in their decisions. And so I do just find it very unlikely that they're going to stop moving in that direction to protect transgender people. given how extreme the right is on trans issues and how much this is sort of the cause of the moment. It just seems to me to be sort of psychologically unlikely that this is where they would say, oh, it's going too far. We're going to really follow the law and the precedent and make sure we're not sort of overreaching in a conservative direction. So I wouldn't expect, I don't know, how the decision is going to be written or which points of law are going to, wind up winning the day. But I think that this is a very conservative court that's willing to completely upend the U.S. legal landscape, and I don't think we should imagine that they're going to exercise some restraint on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very astute observation. I would say that, like, if you're willing to do Dobbs, trans stuff is a lot easier to take on. Dobbs is a much more controversial issue. It's a much more public, much more well known issue, and they seem to have very little shame about that, and in fact are rather upset that we're not praising them more for doing that. I'll also say that the fact that Amy Coney Barrett asked intelligent questions is not a great indicator of her positioning. She's known to ask intelligent questions and then write a concurring opinion with the result and say, well, maybe next time if you argued it just a little bit better, it would work out. And 20 years later in court, it's a different story. The other thing is, I think Gorsuch's silence speaks volumes, right? Gorsuch is one of the most talkative members of the court. He really likes to talk a lot, ask a lot of questions. And as you said, he wrote Bostock. This is something that he was very engaged with just a few years ago. And I think his silence speaks more to the vibes and the politics of the situation than to his well-principled legal opinions on the matter as an attorney.
I mean, not going to be putting any bets on a decision that upholds the right of trans youth to access necessarily healthcare.
Yeah, I guess my final question about this group of people is about John Roberts, the Chief Justice leading the court. Did he feel in charge of his court this time around, or is it still kind of what I think Dobbs felt like, which is that the other justices, specifically talking about Alito and Thomas, are really running the show and pushing things forward in their own way?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the fact that I'm not sure maybe kind of says that I'm leaning towards the last thing that you said. I felt like Kavanaugh and Alito were much more. It certainly intruded much more on my own awareness of what was going on. So yeah, I kind of don't. It didn't feel like the Chief Justice was sort of in a leadership kind of position of kind of driving things forward, but I don't know. I don't, these people and their personalities. I do think it's important to kind of just step back and think about how, like, these are just like 9 people who are not that extraordinary, except that they have been named to the Supreme Court. You know what I mean? I think
Yes.
there's kind of a reverence, and you use their last names and you talk about, what opinions they've read, and you can really find yourself kind of tripping into this sort of being overimpressed with them. And I couldn't see them from where I was standing, but I had a friend who got in through the public line, and what she said was, what this reminded me was just that these are like ordinary human schlubs. Alito was half falling asleep, and I mean, there was sort of a who are these people to put themselves above us kind of sentiment that she had, that I kind of wanted to bring up as maybe one of the last points to make, because at the end of the day, we aren't supposed to have kings in this country. And the idea that 9 people should hold so much power over individuals' lives is maybe kind of obscene, and maybe something that needs to be thought about in a different way if we get the chance to move forward in a positive way at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. These are just 9 people. I think Justice Kagan put it best when she said in a case, we're not the 9 greatest experts on the internet, and I don't think they're the 9 greatest experts on anything in the world, besides maybe being a Supreme Court justice. And I don't know if that qualifies you to make a whole ton of decisions, besides about, like, maybe what you wear to work, The reality of the situation is, though, like they do make the laws right now, and this is what we have. We have a lot of room to grow and a lot of work to do to make sure that this is a court that works for people and not against people. But that's a work that takes a long time, right? In the meantime, as we get kind of prepared for like what seems to be the court moving in a terrible direction this coming year, what are some more productive ways that we can channel this energy? I know I've got a few on mind, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking and what you're feeling, what you're doing to like put something positive out into the world and to really work for trans people instead of working against us.
Yeah, I mean, the coverage on assigned media did not focus on my time in oral arguments. The coverage on assigned media focused on the trans people who gathered outside the court and the way they were holding each other up and expressing their defiance and their commitment to each other and to this community. Um, and certainly the legal landscape can make things much more difficult for people, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. I think it already has hurt a lot of people. But we need to come back to the fact that we have a lot of power as trans people, um, and kind of not go forward in despair, allowing cisgender people, whether they're justices or legislators or whoever they are, to sort of dictate our lives and how we live our lives and who we are, because that's just not within their power, and we shouldn't be giving that to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I think in so many ways, they want us to despair, right? I think the goal of this is like, whether it is to explicitly hurt us or not, I think a feeling that they want to engender is despair, right? And I think to avoid that and to just spread joy, positivity, and like working together to create these other feelings and to live our own authentic lives is like a powerful counter to that. Because I think most people that you interact with in your day to day life want to feel happy and joyful and want to create these positive relationships and are less so interested in making you despair all the time, even if these higher political things going on in the country are rather awful. So, I mean, like what I always want to encourage people is to get involved in your local community, whether that's an organization or just knowing your neighbors. It's way less likely that someone's going to be like the worst person you know and vote against you when they know trans people in their community. When you are like your neighbor and you know how to ask for help, you know that they're going to show up for you. I think those type of like relationships that are both local, in person, as well as like just kind of connected to where you are every day are really important to foster, especially as we move into kind of this darker national picture with everything big going on. So Evan, thank you so much for being here today. Do you have anything to say as we end this? And please tell us where to find all the stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, assigned media is assignedmedia.org. Um, I am mostly active on Blue Sky. I think it's assignedmedia.org, at assignedmedia.org on Blue Sky, at evanurquhart.bsky.social. You know, and yeah, I think everyone needs to just understand that even if things are going to be terrible for a while, that doesn't mean that we're powerless, and that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do. So Assigned Media is going to be there doing the work of being a trans news site, and I encourage everyone to be getting involved and working to uplift our community.
Thank you again to Evan for coming onto the show and for providing such valuable insights and perspectives that we simply wouldn't have without trans journalists like him and their tireless work to cover these issues. And most importantly, thank you to you, our lovely listeners and patrons. This show simply would not be possible without you and your support. Thank you for supporting us, and I'll talk to you soon. Danny Gold, Lex Phoenix, Sebastian sings soprano, Joe the low quality NB, Andrea Brooks, Jack Edwards, Emily Roberts, Dulcie, Stefan Blakemore, Nao Arte, Needles and Threads, Flaming Daphne, Dr. McGee, Genevieve Dickinson, Rachel Harris, Katie Reynolds, Georgia Holden Burnett, Grabalicious, Mix Afon, Root -1, Gray, Elizabeth Anderson, Bernice Roust, Ellen Mellor, Jay Hoskins, Trowan, Ashley, Maddie B, Setcap, Jane, Roberto de Prunk, Rose Absolute, Sarah, Sina, Kiki T, D, Sky Killian, Eric Woodman, B, Jude, Monsieur Squirrel, Fergus Evans, Anubis a Jackal, Kamina, Brandon Craig, Break the System, Sion Phillips, Heidi Reardon, Ezra, Lentil, Clara Viliami. Cool. Amelia, Corvina Ravenheart, the trans metal DJ from Twitch and VR chat, will play Saint Lucifer for props. Tabitha Jo Cox, aka Candy. Fiona McDonald. Murgatroyd. Ontologically Unjust. Stella. Cinder Gosa. Rebecca Prentice. Crazy Richard. Dan Oblivion. Florence Stanley. Helen. L. Hollingsworth. Nick Ross. Melody Nix. Fiona Punchard. John. Nick Duffy. C.B. Bailey. Gordon Cameron. Ted Delphos. Kai Lewin. Vic Parsons. Patreon user. Vic Kelly. Catherine. Sabrina McVeigh. Cassius Adair. Melissa Brooks. Karaken12. April Heller. Sophie Lewis. Alexandra Lilly. Claire Scott. Adrienne Pena. Laura O'Nions. Bernard's Pink Jellybean. Lanos. And Chris Hubley. Thank you all so much.